Welcome back to Business Daily here on Trust TV. Now, before the break, I said we'll be looking at certain issues, but joining me in the studio, or rather joining me virtually here in Abuja to discuss more on this issue is Faiz Muhammad. He is an economic and public affairs analyst. Good morning, Faiz. Thank you for joining us on Business Daily this morning.
Good morning, Chiamaka. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so before we get into our conversation proper, what our first story there this morning is the manufacturers. They're saying that raw materials stuck at ports for weeks, losses anticipated, and there's quite a lot. And one of the things that has come up again in that conversation is this FOB 4% levy by customs. Now, the manufacturers are saying it was suspended, and customs is saying they don't, according to the manufacturers, that they don't know about the suspension. What do you make of this story?
Demurrage is a very serious one, and port authorities have to really look into the question very seriously. It does cause a situation whereby manufacturing firms are at a loss for the work that they're doing. And it also ensures that the Port Authority is taking an inordinate amount from these
Faiz, can you hear us? All right, so we seem to have some technical glitch over there. Hopefully we'll be joined back again by Faiz Muhammad. Now, the conversation, actually, the story, and I have quite a lot of questions from that story, which is the issue, why the manufacturers are having issues, according to the DG, that is Segun Ajayi Carter, is that it is a glitch on the customs part. And if you heard our guest now, he just said something about demurrage. So my questions I have is, who's going to cover the demurrage? Since the fault really is from customs, according to the story, who's going to take over for the demurrage? If these goods are now bad at the time when it's finally released from the port, who's going to cover that loss again? So what's going to happen to the manufacturers? How are they coming to the table to find a solution to this situation where the brunt and the burden of the loss is not so much on the manufacturers, which in turn will come to the consumers at the end of the day, because the manufacturer has to make his money back. So these are the questions that we have from that story, and hopefully some will see, maybe there'll be some response from the parties involved. So back to you, Faiz.
Yes, I was saying that I think it's a reasonable amount of demurrage for the manufacturers to have to deal with. I think that unfortunately, because of that level of demurrage, it will be a situation whereby the cost implications are then passed on to the customers, which then reduces the amount of customers to get in future. It's a serious glitch within the system that the Port Authority has to take into consideration and solve as quickly as possible.
So one of the questions I was asking while we're waiting for you to return is, who's going to bear the burden? Because now now there's an issue. Will they waive the demurrage since it's an issue from their end? What's going to happen to somehow alleviate this impact? Because as you said again, as I said before, it's going to come down to the consumers. So how can this issue be resolved in a way that the impact isn't felt so much?
It could be done in such a way that you ensure that as much as possible there's a concession that is for the manufacturers themselves, reducing the amount of demurrage that is accrued to them. However, that is going to take a significant amount of time because stakeholders would have to be engaged in the immediate. The reality of the situation is that customers are going to be the one who are bearing the price.
All right, then. Let's now get to our conversation for today. It's about the inflation. We started that yesterday. We spoke to Dr. Emmanuel Bashayi. He joined virtually from Kano, and we had a bit of a conversation. But let's still look into it again today. The inflation numbers are down 21.88% for July 2025. If you joined us yesterday, you heard all that, all those numbers. However, food inflation climbed. From the table we had yesterday, we could see that it was climbing gradually. Actually, it climbed in April, and then climbed it climbed in May, then in June, and then it went shut off in July to 22.74. Actually, quite a very large number. Now, one of the questions that I asked my guests, and I'm going to put that to you this morning, is the numbers are going down. Food inflation is going up. However, food inflation is one of the indices that keeps inflation numbers high. How is this working?
Well, you see, we're dealing with inflation, and this inflation is fragile because food inflation remains persistently high. So while it's begun to moderate due to tighter monetary policy and some stabilization measures, the truth is that food accounts for more than half the consumer basket, and it's driven by structural issues outside of monetary policy's reach. Insecurity in food producing regions, poor logistics, import dependency, energy costs, each of these worsen price volatility. So unless these structural bottlenecks are trend may or even reverse, sustained disinflation require long-term in agricultural productivity and improve security in these rural areas. Without these, even if inflation slows, ordinary Nigerians will not feel relief because food prices are central to household budgets. So disinflation remains vulnerable, and its sustainability depends on complementary fiscal reforms beyond the central bank's monetary tightening.
Okay, you brought us to the monetary tightening. I was going to go that next. We can see that one of the key things that helped with this inflation numbers is the tightening at 27.5% maintained in the past three meetings. However, the question here is now, the 27.5% interest rate choking growth, is it going to really help tame prices? Is it really helping?
You know, at 27.5%, that's one of the highest in the world, which really reflects the central bank's aggressive stance against it. While this has aided in slowing headline inflation, it's also significantly raised our borrowing costs, which means credit access for businesses and households has come down significantly. SMEs, which depend heavily on bank loans for working capital, will be particularly constrained. I think many would be shelving any expansion plans to really grow the company, or most of them are probably struggling to stay afloat. On the consumer side, I think these rates discourage borrowing for everything: household, education, consumption, which means there's weaker demand. I think one of the arguments that this risk that is marked by, but the central bank views price stability as a prerequisite for long-term growth, even if short-term trade-offs exist. I think the real challenge is in balancing inflation control with growth support. Without further fiscal reforms, and at this point, that's going to include targeted subsidies and tax relief. I think monetary tightening alone will simply overburden the economy and leave growth stagnant, despite these modest gains that we're seeing.
Okay. Well, still saying what you've said, following up on what you've said, you talked about beyond the monetary policy tightening. What fiscal tools, rather, do you think the government needs to put in place? Because you said it already, fiscal tools need to put in place away from just monetary tightening. What are these tools? You know, tax relief, you've mentioned tax relief and subsidies. What are they that can be exactly pinpoint certain areas and we could have these things happen that could actually help, you know, in the long run?
So like I already mentioned, tax relief for small businesses and low income earners would really help reduce production costs and ease the stress that is currently on financial households. Um, I think when it comes to subsidies, rather than blanket fuel subsidies, Government could focus on transport and agricultural subsidies that lower logistics costs and therefore boost the food supply. Expanded social scheme is equally critical, whether that's conditional cash transfers or school feeding programs, or even health insurance schemes. These can help protect vulnerable households from erosion of their purchasing power. I think importantly, fiscal tools have to be designed to be temporary and well targeted because otherwise they're simply going to worsen our fiscal deficits. So if we can ease the cost of living burden and support productivity, I think these would help balanced policy mix and would allow the central bank's tightening to work without stifling growth excessively.
All right. Now, last question on inflation, so we could go to our other conversation. We see that the numbers are going down month on month. Now, peradventure, somehow, we get to less than 20% by year end. How will this, or will it actually improve the living standards for Nigerians? Seems like we're having a bit of a technical issue.
Percent inflation?
Yes, if we get below 24.
I'm not.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure that's entirely likely within a year, but it would signal progress in stabilizing the economy. Um, but the effect on living standards would be limited in the short term. Lower inflation doesn't equate to falling prices. It simply means prices are rising slowly. So since households have already endured years of cumulative price increases, their purchasing power remains eroded. Wages and incomes haven't kept pace with inflation. So that means that stable prices still feel unaffordable. Although if disinflation is sustained, it could restore confidence, attract investment, and eventually that would translate into jobs and better investment over time. But falling below 20%, although that would be a welcome milestone, it would not lead to immediate solutions in the cost of living crisis.
Okay. All right. Now, we're still going to be dealing with something that has to do with the standard of living and inflation prices. And it's the minimum wage situation in the country. Now, this report by Noel Sampson gives us more. Take a look.
For many Nigerians in the private sector, the struggle to earn a decent wage is an everyday reality. While the minimum wage law exists on paper, enforcement often feels like a distant dream for workers trying to survive in today's economy. But there's a message of hope, as the Director General of the Nigerian Employers Consultative Association, NECA, Adewale Smith Oyorinde, says employers no longer have to suffer in silence.
The Minimum Wage Act itself has provisions that gives the employee the right to escalate. Any employee that is not being paid the minimum wage and is collecting it is a co-conspirator. It's basically a co-conspirator. The law gives the employee the right to escalate, to approach the National Industrial Court, or worst case scenario, approach the organized labor to that, look, this I'm not being paid the minimum wage. While we understand that the law of demand and supply will always play its role as per so many people pursuing very little jobs, but the cap we have created as per minimum wage, I think it was a collective decision between employers, workers, and government. So we expect all employers to abide by that minimum wage law. It's the law.
Oyorinde said the need to use advocacy to promote the interests of the private sector workers necessitated the signing of a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU signing, between NECA and the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, CISLAC. He emphasized the importance of advocacy, noting that it plays a crucial role in empowering individuals and communities by ensuring their voices are heard, their rights protected, and their needs addressed.
There are a lot of advocacy efforts that we are going to initiate. Economic advocacy, fair tax regime, fair regulatory environment, fair legislative engagement, protection of workers themselves, protection of the informal sector. So that collaboration will strengthen our capacity to advocate on both sides. And then once we draw those issues to government, we make policy recommendations, share alternative policy recommendations. We believe government will listen more, especially when those recommendations are research-driven.
We noted that there are quite a number of policy issues that require advocacy, for the protection of workers, for the ease of doing business, for enhanced, productivity, and helping to drive the economy. And therefore, NECA works in this area, and we believe that we can synergize, we can work together to ensure that we have more enabling policies that can help, business strive.
The MOU provides a framework to enhance public policy formulation and implementation through evidence-based research and advocacy, promote decent work and uphold labor's right for a fair and productive workforce, as well as foster responsible business conduct and ethical corporate practices, among other benefits. Noel Samson, Trust TV News, Abuja.
Now, that's a report by Noel Sampson on the minimum wage. And, you could see the caption there saying private sector workers should, report their organizations if they aren't paying minimum wage. But yesterday, we had on this same program a report from the United States that says that Nigerian minimum wage insufficient to live citizens out of poverty. Now, the United States Department of State's 2024 Human Rights Report, released in August 2025, found that Nigeria's recently approved minimum wage of 70,000 naira per month, which is equivalent to $47.90, is grossly inadequate to lift citizens out of poverty. The key reasons: the wages' real value is eroded by high inflation and the naira devaluation. Enforcement is weak, and we had that from that package too. Many states and private employees have not fully implemented it. The informal economy, which employs 70 to 80% of Nigerians, lies outside the scope of wage protections. Now, cost of living versus minimum wage. 70,000 naira, and your house rent is give or take about minimum 300,000 naira. How are you able to do that and still survive and transport yourself to work, to feed? That is what we're going to be looking at this morning. Faiz, you've heard that report, and you probably heard me say some of the things, and I'm sure you've come across the story yourself as well. And one of the things that stands out for me is, first, how are we going to manage? Because yes, 70,000 naira, $47.90 is what some people spend in a day in the United States, and that's it. That's for feeding and maybe transportation, and that's it. They spend that in a day, and that's what we are supposed to, for the barest minimum. Anybody out there who has, I think, SSC, that's what you're supposed to pay the minimum. How are we supposed to survive on that amount of money monthly? One. Two, advocacy. And equally, the enforcement situation. Apparently, even Abuja and about 20 other states haven't implemented or enforced it fully into, that it's minimum wage at 70,000 naira for workers. What is going on?
Well, I'll start with the second question. It's actually very simple. There isn't enough money to go around. 70,000 is simply not feasible for a lot of companies, considering the devalued nature of the naira. And it certainly isn't feasible for the government's finances. The truth of the matter is that we need to look at linking a living wage to inflation. So instead of just setting a fixed salary number, we have to design a wage system that moves with the cost of living. Prices of food, transport, and rent, those are going to change all the time as long as inflation moves. So if wages stay the same while these prices rise, everybody suffers. We have to have a living wage policy that means salaries are adjusted regularly based on inflation. And this means that the government would have to collect data on the average cost of living every few months and set wages that reflect these realities. This ensures that workers don't fall back into poverty just because prices increase. This has happened in countries like Brazil and South Africa, and they've used similar systems to protect workers from inflation shock. The challenge, I believe, is making sure that employers, especially small businesses, can afford to pay without collapsing. And that's really where the challenge is with the 70,000 minimum. The vast majority of SMEs would collapse if they were to implement this. And that's where tax breaks come in. You have to have tax incentives and targeted support for these SMEs and these employers, because if they'll be needed, if designed well, this policy ensure wages, protect people, reduce poverty, and because prices aren't as much of an issue, it would increase productivity.
Faiz? All right, Faiz, if you can hear us. Now, you said...
Yes, I can hear you.
If you said living wage and minimum wage, could you actually differentiate? Tell us what the difference is between a living wage and the minimum wage.
Okay, so Nigeria is a very diverse country. The cost of living in Lagos is much higher than it is in Sokoto, for example, right? The living amount of money that you would need to go through a day's activities, rent, transport, food prices, is different from the minimum wage, which is the set amount, the set salary amount that the government has adjusted to pay for all of these things. So a single minimum wage for the whole country might not be accurate, but a living wage that takes into consideration um, income based on region makes much more sense.
Okay. Now, one of the issues that came up in both the story from and the report by the United States and equally the report by Noel Sampson is the issue of enforcement. And, you know, a lot of people, I for one, I wonder why some states have found it, you know, difficult to implement the national minimum wage of 70. First of all, some states found it difficult to implement the 30,000 naira minimum wage at the time. And now it's up to 70,000 naira, and they're saying if we couldn't do 30, how are we going to do 70? Now, my question is, why is there a problem with implementing the 70,000 naira minimum wage? What's the issue? Are the states not generating funds when they go to FAC? What they collect, is it not enough to run the state and as well pay workers? What's the wage bill like that it's difficult to increase, you know, and pay 70,000 naira monthly?
Well, yes, actually, all of your questions provided answers as well. I think that not too long ago, there was a report that came out from the NBS that clarified the simple fact that when it comes to internally generated revenue, there are probably only 3 or 4 states in Nigeria that are generating enough. And there are only 5 states in Nigeria that are taking in enough in terms of foreign investment to be considered viable. Which means that for the vast majority of states in Nigeria, they simply either aren't generating enough, or the FAC disbursements aren't adequate for the state's needs. And that's simply the reality of our fiscal struggles in this country right now. Whether that has to do with the fact our borrowing schemes, um, our debt burden, which makes it harder for the government to finance its obligations, or whether that has to do with inflation figures devaluing the naira itself, making it difficult for anyone to be able to pay a fair wage. The reality is simply that 70,000 is not feasible for the vast majority of state governments and for the majority of private sector partners.
Now, we've talked about the states, we talked about that, but now let's go into it a bit more. What fiscal reforms, can aid the states to be able to meet up with paying this minimum wage? These states that really, one, are not generating enough, and maybe their FAC allocation is not even enough for them. What fiscal reforms can be done or can be given to them to enable them at least pay the minimum wage?
First is improving tax collection. So there are more people and businesses contributing fairly, reducing wasteful spending, ensuring that state revenues are transparently. Some states depend almost entirely on federal allocations from oil money. And I think this is really because when oil prices drop, salaries automatically suffer. They have to look for new revenue sources, whether that's local taxes, land use fees, or simply local industries that can grow their tax base. Subsidies would also have to be restructured so that funds go to areas that directly help workers, like affordable food or transport. I think a lot of it has to do with financial discipline. States can plan their salaries more reliably, and this political will to cut corruption and waste because unpaid wages create poverty and unrest. Without reforms, even the best wage laws will fail because workers may be promised higher salaries that never arrive. So, more than anything, stable financing and fiscal discipline is the backbone of any wage policy that the states need to implement in order to really meet their obligations.
All right. Now, when we say states and not being able to pay 70,000 naira minimum wage or the minimum wage, as the case may be, we're mostly talking about the government, not necessarily the private business owner there. However, of course, if the government is able to pay the money, then the private business person in the state should. Now, what my question is this: is it safe to say that due to the fact that government seems to be one of the largest employers of labor, that this is a problem in itself, and that if possibly there are more upcoming businesses, will that somehow relieve the burden on the government and enable them pay the minimum wage to the staff that is needed? Because again, we have ghost workers too, to get the job done at the state level.
So I think those are two actually very separate issues. When it comes to the private sector, it has more to do with macroeconomic business environment. The government is generating money from government services and the sale from exports of either oil or agricultural produce. But when it comes to private sector, they're producing revenue from various other areas. Now, those end sector it is can be either high return or low return, but all of that depends on the business environment itself. How valuable is the naira? How stable is it? What is the relationship between our import dependency and fluctuations in our currency? If we can't solve all of these macroeconomic issues, then we can't expect consistent revenue and consistent profitability from the private sector. So it's very important that these issues are addressed from a governing perspective so that the private sector has enough profits to drive an increase in their business operations, which means hiring more people, which means being able to pay them a fair wage. When it comes to the governing side, I would actually argue that there are various areas of government that require more people to be employed, whether that is in immigration services, whether that's in policing, whether
Okay.
it's in IT services. But all of that is going to be very difficult to see to fruition if the government doesn't have its finances in order.
All right. Now, let's go to exemptions for SMEs. Now, SMEs, they make, and we even from our story, from the report, those in the formal sector are not captured in the whole minimum wage conversations. Yes, we hear organized private sector, we hear organized labor, but I don't think it actually gets down to the market person or the shop attendant who is being paid less than 70,000 naira, at times paid 50,000, 40,000 naira to be a shop attendant or something. This doesn't reflect them. One, how do we capture them into this so that they are beneficiaries as well? Because some of them are even graduates, but life has happened and they've had to find themselves in a place whereby they have to do these things to somehow make ends meet and keep busy. So one, how do we factor in the informal sector into the minimum wage conversation so that it affects them, it's implemented as well? Also, secondly, how will SMEs be able to keep up? Should there be some sort of exemptions for them, for those who actually want to go ahead and pay this minimum wage, but due to maybe high cost of production and all that, should there be some sort of exemptions for them to enable them meet up with this?
Okay, so I think current labor law exempts very small firms from paying the official minimum wage. The idea is to protect businesses from collapsing under heavy costs, but I think the exemption also leaves millions of informal workers trapped in poverty. Many small businesses pay very low wages, said below 70,000 a month, and without a legal wage floor, these workers have no. On the other hand, I think removing the exemption might put too much pressure on small firms that are already struggling in this economy. So we have to find a middle ground. Instead of exempting them completely, government could introduce a graduated wage system where micro businesses pay a slightly lower rate, but still above poverty levels. Also has to provide support. That's the truth. Whether it's tax breaks or loans to help these firms pay fairer wages, keeping the exemption as it continues to encourage both informality and inequality. We have to have some level of flexibility to this law. And now, when minimum wages go up, SMEs may struggle to pay without cutting jobs or shutting them down entirely. To survive, these SMEs need targeted support, grants to help them adjust in whatever form that is possible. For example, if you're a bakery with 10 workers, you might not afford sudden wage, but a spread would help the company cope. So encouraging local purchasing of raw materials can also help because it'll ease pressure on wages. I think if SMEs collapse under wage hikes, unemployment rises, so the
All right,
wages while supporting with.
All right, thank you so much, Faiz Muhammad. It's been good having you, sharing your insights on the situation. First, with the inflation, impact, declining, however, but the impact has not really been felt by the people, and of course, the minimum wage crisis we have in Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning, sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Faiz Muhammad. And we've been discussing this morning on the inflation. We continued our conversation from yesterday, and we now went into the situation from that report from the US saying that our minimum wage is insufficient for us, Nigeria, 70,000 naira. That's just $47.90. That's quite not a lot of money to do anything for anyone, but that's the situation of things. Hopefully things will get better and, we will get to a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage. That's so much we have for you this morning on the program. I've been your host, Chiamaka Nwafor. For more of our programs, documentaries, and news, do want to follow us on our social media platform and on our YouTube live stream. Same time, same place tomorrow. Bye for now.